what is the current reality if you only knew the truth? As Jack Nicholson would say, you can't handle the truth. I don't even know where to start. All I can tell you is that, as weird as this might sound, and I come from inside the media, I come from having had national radio shows on 2 different networks with, hundreds of affiliates, with starting out knowing astronauts and knowing people in the military industrial complex, having relatives who were colonels in the Marine Corps and admirals in the Navy, and there is so little of your reality that is really based on truth that it's just stunning. I mean, if I told you that the very nature of the moon and Mars and most of the planets in the solar system is being kept from you for specific reasons to make you think that you're completely alone and that these planets can't be colonized. To ask that kind of question, the problem with anything in this field is that ultimately it's like running through a luminous field of weeds. Eventually you get to a black wall and are faced with virtually nothing but Zen cones and riddles as to what's on the other side of that wall. It's not like these people in the government, call somebody like me up on the phone and tell them, well, this is our evil scheme today. It's kind of a weird thing too, is because it's almost, the more you know about this field, it becomes almost paralyzing, because the more you know, the less you know. The more you know and the more open-minded you are about this, the more you realize that every answer you find just leads to 1,000 more questions. You can go back to whether or not it was German technology, and originally in the 1930s, that with the von Schauberger implosion engines and electromagnetics and whatever else, did the Germans escape to the South Pole or somewhere in South America, and are these beautiful blonde Nordic extraterrestrials really just Germans in disguise? When you go to Area 51, and I've seen with my own eyes flying disc technology videotape this thing, doing right angle turns and skipping across the sky and appearing and disappearing. Once again, extraterrestrial, UFOs, but who's flying them? Is it our military learning how to fly them, or are they actual extraterrestrials that are captured there? When you see shuttles that are 1,600 feet long, when you interview scientists who claim that we've had vehicles capable of extrasolar travel since the early 1970s, when you think that there are cults, if you will, scientific cults that have existed for hundreds of years, and that maybe we've never lost a single advance in technology since Da Vinci. Maybe when he invented the airplane and the helicopter and the tank and the submarine and whatever else back in the 16th century, that there are groups of people maybe who've been developing that technology all along. When you think about human development, the way the Islamic world was developing in the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. In the 10th century in Turkey, they had gaslit streets and hot and cold running water, while we Europeans were rolling in the mud looking for grubs. And had the Crusades not occurred, the Arabs probably would have put a man on the moon sometime in the 1800s. So when you look at somebody like Jules Verne or H.G. Wells or George Orwell, all of whom were Fabian socialists, and the Fabian socialists being inside this core advance in technology, that what they were looking at as science fiction was in fact a reality that was being revealed to them by these secret societies that said, this is what we could do. If you look at H.G. Wells' First Men on the Moon, and you look at the actual accuracies of First Men on the Moon as opposed to what they did with Apollo, it's really pretty stunning. There is a body of evidence that shows that there are bases on the moon, all over the place, backside of the moon, front side of the moon, that the moon is constantly being mined, that there are objects that travel back and forth across the moon. But once again, is it us or is it them? There have been records from the London Royal Observatory back through the 1700s of lights on the moon and bridges on the moon and all kinds of crazy things on the moon. In 1955, there was a bridge over a chasm that was something like 100 miles long that just appeared overnight after a series of red and green lights were seen over that particular area. Again, was it us? Did the National Security Agency really land on the moon in 1953? Is it the Germans with their technology? Are they the Fourth Reich? Are they Hitler's last battalion that will tip the scales when the final battle of East meets West occurs, as Hitler had said. I don't know. I mean, again, what's being covered up, and there's ships out there, and who's flying them, and is it us or them? Aldous Huxley said something very interesting when he said that we found a footprint upon the face of the unknown, and found to our dismay that it is in fact ours. My father was in aerospace, and was a customer communications vice president of TRW, worked for Martin Marietta, worked for TRW, hence NASA. They built the lunar modules and satellites and rockets and whatever else. I grew up around astronauts: Gus Grissom, Gordon Cooper, Don Isley, Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong. I have two godfathers that have walked on the moon: David Scott, Harrison Jack Schmidt. So I mean, I knew the guys that were there. I knew the guys that had access, and were the dudes going up in space. Meanwhile, I got interested in this because they always felt that, especially Gus Grissom, who was probably the person I was closest to, felt that they were spam in a can, that they were that the astronauts were just a public relations campaign for a secret military program that was spending much more. The military space program was getting, was a gleaming jewel compared to the junk that NASA was getting at the time, and they always felt that there was some kind of cover-up. I got into this because Jim Levitt, for example, is McDivitt, James McDivitt, came and showed UFO photos on the wall of our house, and these guys used to take these little Bell and Howell wind up 8mm cameras in their suits and take pictures of these things that used to follow the craft out the windows, and they couldn't show them to anybody else, so they'd come over and we'd set up a big sheet, how it was in the 60s, and people would watch these UFO photos. We'd sit there and watch them on the wall. Years later, I interviewed Gordon Cooper, and I was the first one to get him to admit that that he'd seen extraterrestrial craft in space, that he saw UFOs at Area 51. Gordon was very active in it because he tried to get the United Nations to come up with extraterrestrial contact protocols, and Gordon and I were actually very close right up to his death last year. And so then I got, with that background in aerospace and knowing all these guys that had been there and had all these amazing experiences, in 1990 I was a co-director and co-producer on a documentary series called UFO Contactees, and we traveled all around the world and collected about 600 hours of footage with UFO contactees, abductees, scientists, researchers. Somebody had a dog barked at a UFO. We went out and talked to him. Joe Randazzo was our on-camera guy and executive producer. Richard Kashansky was our cameraman. And we spent about 3-4 months maybe in 1990, like I said, collecting about 600 hours of interviews. We went to Spain. We went to where we interviewed Fortunato Zanfretta. We went to Switzerland, where we interviewed Billy Meyer for the first time in like 10 years. We went to France. We went to Canada. We went to Yugoslavia. We went up and down the east coast of the United States, just doing nothing but kind of chasing this phenomenon. So at that time in 1990, it made me one of the foremost experts in the world on this topic, because nobody had just gone out and spoken to everybody and taken the time to actually get their stories on film, which then led to strange enough, our interviewing a scientist by the name of Bob Lazar here in Nevada, who said, you don't have to believe anything I say. Go out to Highway 375 by this black mailbox out there, and they test UFOs on Wednesday nights, and you'll see them. So myself and a friend of mine went out a year later in February of 91, and I dragged another buddy of mine who was a lady that wrote for the LA Times, and we had a disc almost hit our car, and bounced around in the desert and chased after it, and a big group of people saw it, and it wound up on the front page of the LA Times. And then I found a hilltop that looked down on the base and videotaped Area 51 for the first time. John Lear had taken some photos of it back in the late 70s, but I'd actually videotaped the modern base. Kind of kept it to myself for a while, and then I came out with it in December of 91, and then that started all kinds of people going out there, who I'm sure have claimed they discovered it or they found it, or everybody wanted to lay some claim to fame to, the Whitesides mountain spot. Really jagged off the military, the fact that I found a chink in their armor and found a hilltop that looked right down their throat. And I was sitting up there with a video camera with a bunch of friends of mine, videotaping the most top secret above ground military installation that they maintained on a pretty regular basis, and saw some amazing things. Saw discs on a pretty regular basis there, you know, along with all the people that we would take out there. We started kind of putting together tours of people who would just all contribute money, and we'd all rent a van and, you know, pay for food, and, you know, I'll pitch in about $100 a piece and go out there and climb up the hill and take a look at the base. And of the things that we saw out there that were not just the discs, we saw at one time a huge black triangular object that moved, that had parked itself there all night, and then early in the morning of the next day, in the dawn hours, this big triangular object just moved across the sky, as if it had been sitting there all, you know, all evening. We saw a shuttle there once that came in sometime in late 1992. If you remember, in the early 1990s, there was this weird phenomenon that was occurring over Southern California that geologists were calling skyquakes. And they were saying that it was multiple objects that were traveling in from space, that were zeroing in on Catalina Island and the lights of Southern California and landing at Area 51. And this was all over the newscast at that time. And we actually saw what the thing was. It was not two objects, it was one gigantic object that had a big, flat, blunt shovel nose on it. Looked like two door stops, one on top of the other, a huge, we call it a flying wedge. The back end looked kind of like a scooped up Corvette, but this thing was huge. It was with this big blunt nose on it. There was a light on the top, a light on the top, the nose, a light on the top, a light on the belly, and there was all kinds of chase planes and choppers around it. But we later guesstimated that this thing was probably 1,600 feet long, and it came in from one end of the valley, swooped around, and then landed at 51. So a couple of years later, we saw the same thing on the Discovery Channel on an animation that said that this was the X-33, and that this was something that was a 1,500-foot shuttle and was going to be used sometime in the year 2025. And so I'm sure we saw a prototype model of it out there, outside of the little discs that we used to see and photograph all the time. So it was pretty crazy. The military moved a lot of its stuff. This was when I took Geraldo Rivera out there, and I worked on a show called Now It Can Be Told. We were on the Montel Williams show, and Montel said he would go out there. By that time, Montel kept putting me off. So by that time, they'd moved everything, and we'd been sleeping out in the dirt for about 6 months or so, and we hadn't seen anything. So when he finally got around to going, I didn't take him, because I just said, look, I told you they were going to move it all. It's all gone. The rumor is that they eventually moved most of the saucers that they had at the S4 facility to someplace called Area 6413 in Utah. And the legend is, or the rumor is that now under Kings Peak, Utah, in the Uinta National Forest, is now where the center of the U.S. Space Command is. And there's a gigantic underground base, and the mountain opens up, and they've got all kinds of stuff coming and going. But like I said, that's just the mythology and the rumor. And since then, I've worked on, I've tried to do stories on the type of phenomenon, everything from kind of metaphysics and UFOs and the bizarre and the unusual. I worked as a writer and a producer on hard copy for about a year and a half or so, which was the second biggest show in syndication. I was one of the original creator producers on a show for UPN. I was actually asked by the owner of the network to come in and set up a show called Strange Universe. And I worked on the pilots of Strange Universe, and the show ran for about 2.5 years or so. Worked as a consultant on Unsolved Mysteries, was in on the ground floor of the original alien autopsy footage, which a buddy of mine, Bob Kevitt, was the executive producer on. Was also in on another one, which I actually thought was more legitimate. I didn't think the alien autopsy footage looked right to me, which is one of the reasons why I kind of bowed out of it. And I was involved in another piece of footage, which was called the Alien Interview, which a lot of people dismissed, but I thought actually had much more realism to it. That was 2 minutes and 55 seconds of an actual living alien being that was photographed at Area 51, that was brought out by a guy named Victor, who didn't want his name or face used. And we did, I thought, some revolutionary radio interviews with the guy between myself and Art Bell and Victor on the TV. And this was a big thing in Japan. It was a big thing in Europe. It sold as a video. And I thought Victor gave us some real insights into what contact with an actual extraterrestrial being was like. We asked him, did we communicate with this being? And he said, well, when you pat your dog on the head and say, good boy, are you communicating with your dog? He said that was kind of what it was like dealing with this being. So And then I broke a number of stories on, I was the first one to do national stories on the Chupacabra in Puerto Rico for Strange Universe. Went down there and ran through the jungles for about 2 weeks or so, and got some, I think, some pretty amazing footage of the carnage this creature was leaving behind. We showed up at a farmer's house literally about an hour and a half after 3 of these things had torn through his farm and like killed every animal on his farm. And the rabbits had these bizarre drill holes in their skulls, and apparently the chupacabras have these very sharp tongues that they drill literally holes through skull and bone with, and then suck the blood out of these animals. And so that was New Year's Day of 1996. Broke the first stories on that. When I was working for Hard Copy, I broke the first national stories on the Phoenix Lights. When the Phoenix Lights returned, actually, the Phoenix Lights were there on March 13th of 1997, and then they came back January 18th of 1998. And after that, we did the hard copy piece on it because nobody in the national media had covered the fact that a 22-mile across UFO had parked itself over a major American city, including the media, which is where the whole ABC Peter Jennings laugh-a-thon comes in, that seeing is believing, which should have been, seeing is believing the recreation, because with all the hundreds, if not thousands of hours of UFO footage, why they didn't show any of it, and still started with stuff like, Roswell. You're like, hey dog, that ain't new, and it's just a lot of outrageous things in that whole deal. For example, Roswell is an American myth without a shred of evidence, which I thought was nonsense, completely ignoring Philip Corso in his best-selling book The Day After Roswell, totally ignoring the dying testimony of Jesse Marcel, ignoring the testimony of his son, ignoring the testimony of Mac Brazel, who's the guy who originally saw it, ignoring, on and on and on. And then they just told a whole series of lies about the Phoenix Lights. This is ABC News, after all, and if they're claiming that it's just flares, then why did they not have any military presence? Why did they not speak to the National Guard that claimed that they were having the maneuvers that night that supposedly dropped the flares? And they couldn't, because they couldn't get the National Guard guys on TV, because the National Guard would be lying, because they weren't flares. We had the lights analyzed, very simple spectral analysis that could be done on videotape. They were not flares of any kind. They were a very unusual light source. And these lights were actually videotaped from about 17 different angles all around the valley, even more so when the Phoenix Lights came back in January of '98. And with no real mention that nobody in the national media, with the exception of Hard Copy, covered it. And I think Dan Rather mentioned it. Dan Rather mentioned it for about 15 seconds and said there were some lights, but it turned out to be flares. When we went to investigate the case, by the way, and I called the National Guard and tried to get their official story on film about the flares, they said that the flares were that it was a war game that was taking place about 8 o'clock. And I said, well, or I'm sorry, it's taking place about 10:30 or so is what they were saying. And I said, well, we've got 17 pieces of video from all these different locations that show that if you were dropping flares right in the approach corridor for the Sky Harbor International Airport, then somebody's going to jail. And they wouldn't talk to us. They hung up the phone on us. We went over there. We pounded on the door. They wouldn't let us in. We were a national news crew, and we couldn't get a single person to actually admit to this bogus flare story from the National Guard, because they were not flares. We did interview one guy, a former Vietnam veteran and war hero, who claimed that he actually videotaped this gigantic craft from the roof of his house, and had called the city councilwoman and said, would you like this videotape? And she said yes, wrap it up a certain way and put a certain number on it. He was about ready to walk out this door, and he claimed these 2 weird little Asian guys with kind of yellow skin and the black sunglasses and the black suits and the mo haircuts showed up at his door. And he said they moved like robots, and they took the tape. They said, we're here to get the tape, and have you shown this to anybody, and you made any copies? And when he said no, they took the tape, turned around, and walked out. We then got the testimony of a Monsignor of the Phoenix Parish, who'd been a Catholic priest there for 25 years, who was coming to visit this gentleman, who said that he watched them walk out into the parking lot, get into a jet black 1955 Buick Roadmaster with blacked out windows. And he said he didn't hear the car start, and the wheels didn't move, and the thing just glided out of the parking lot. And this is a Catholic priest that we had on tape talking about this kind of very cool Men in Black story that, and you don't get, a lot of people think, there's Men in Black stories all over ufology. There really aren't. The Men in Black stories are all from the early 1950s or so, regardless of what the movies say. But, for the first time we had a really cool actual eyewitness, 2 people actually witnessing the car and the 2 men, and confiscating some really serious evidence of what these things were. I was in contact with another gentleman who claimed he was in contact with the Pleiadians, a guy who called himself Adrian, and also known as the rather famous Miami contacts that were originally covered by Randy Winters. And I became involved in it when we kept trying to make a special out of this, some kind of TV show out of this gentleman, and he would never give us the rights. He would never give us the proper paperwork to do anything with it. But he had photos, and his girlfriend had ridden on the ships, and he had landed craft and pictures of his girlfriend getting on the craft, and video everywhere all over Miami. And he eventually moved to Germany and just kind of disappeared into Europe. So, and it was, the 90s were really a heyday for ufology. When you think about all the shows, you had sightings, and sightings eventually then led to the X-Files, and then you had Unsolved Mysteries and Hard Copy and Strange Universe and Roswell the series, and special after special after special, a UPN special called Danger in Our Skies. There was UFOs everywhere. And then right about 97, 98, I watched it happen from the inside, that you had about 100 media outlets that were all doing very cool metaphysical, new age UFO kind of shows, and one by one, these big media conglomerates just basically systematically bought them up and crushed everything that would have to do with the UFO phenomenon, including, I might add, Clear Channel buying up 49% of the radio market and buying up Coast to Coast, and Rush Limbaugh and Dr. Laura and whatever else. And there's I'm not sure if there's any censorship there, but what is considered the premier flagship UFO type of program with Art Bell and George Norrie is still owned by a company that isn't really comfortable with the subject. So many people being concerned with terrorism and Arabs and whatever else, and what we view as supposedly real life concerns. Nobody seems too concerned about extraterrestrials or what they have to say or what they're doing around the planet, because we're too terrified half the time. And so here it is, 2005, and the fact that Peter Jennings can get on ABC and cover Roswell from 60 years ago, and the Phoenix Lights, and a couple of other stories from a few other people with reenactments, not even real footage. I don't know, just shows the sad state of affairs as far as this entire. It's gone back to, once again, kind of a cult status. It's lost the popular shine that it had throughout the 1990s, and it's gone back to the tried and true believers at the UFO World Congress and local meetings in MUFON and what have you. I just thought the real travesty of the Peter Jennings special was that you literally have more people in this country who believe in UFOs and extraterrestrial life than believe they're going to get Social Security by the time they turn 65. So with close to 67% of the people believing in UFOs and extraterrestrials, those who don't and those who debunk the phenomenon, they are the ones that are in the crazed, moronic, low IQ minority, no longer the people that the people in this country who are the ones who have seen the craft or believe in the craft or understand that we may not be alone in the universe. Of course, the problem is, and Peter Jennings did say this, that he believes in UFOs, he just doesn't know who's driving them. And he has said quite a few times that he felt that the U.S. government's behavior towards people who have seen UFOs has been atrocious. Of course, Peter Jennings can say that because it's our government and he's Canadian. So, when he gets on the TV and says, your government is behaving very badly, the fact that we have, the premier American newsman is from, Montreal or something. So, and some other comments, like, for example, if I can throw this in, the Seattle Chat Club is one of the most active UFO chapters in the country, run by a good friend of mine, Charlotte Lefevre. And they had a huge rally for Peter Jennings with Peter Davenport up in Seattle. And hundreds of people showed up at a big sort of municipal hall, and there was a stage, and Peter Jennings came across and shook Davenport's hand after Peter Davenport gave this presentation. And rather unfairly, Peter Jennings made it look as though Peter Davenport was just a lone guy in his house with a tape recorder, and that he's the only guy who covers UFOs full time. Did I turn up any definitive proof of alien races walking among us? I guess it depends on what your definition of definitive is. If, for example, you take the eyewitness accounts of respected scientists in their field who would say yes. People like Dr. Anthony Ribera, who was the partner of Jacques Cousteau, who began the Calypso Foundation, who partnered with Cousteau for 25 years, written over 60 books on not only UFOs but oceanographic tectonics. And you have Dr. Ribera claim that he was part of a group of scientists that were directly being contacted by a race of beings called the UMO, who came from the Wolf 423 star system in the constellation of Virgo. If you claim definitive proof as being, for example, the alien interview tape that we got, who was a guy who claimed he worked at Area 51, who brought this 2 minutes and 55 seconds of footage out that we had analyzed by doctors and Hollywood special effects people. The special effects people said, oh, it was fake, but then again we said, okay, if it's fake, how much would it cost to fake it, and why don't you do it? None of them could, and none of them would, by the way. We showed it to doctors, and there was a heart monitor that was actually in the background as this poor little being was kind of having what appeared to be an attack of some kind. And there was a doctor who said, this is real, because there's no way that you would be able to fake that heart monitor and work a puppet. If it was a puppet, you would have to know what that heart monitor did. The heart monitor already has an unusual signature, because the being itself had an unusual sort of heart-lung arrangement, which instead of like a lub-dub, it was like boom, boom. It was sort of a weird beat to it. But when the being started having an attack, this thing started doing all kinds of crazy things, and this emergency room technician said, that's impossible to do. If you were working that puppet, you'd have to know every breath would have to go on that monitor. You know, I was when I was in Puerto Rico with the Chupacabra. You know, we saw footprints. We had hundreds of people who had eyewitness accounts. But once again, is it just some weird creature that hibernates and comes up every 100 years, like, you know, the Jersey Devil or the, you know, the Sasquatch or the skunk ape, or, you know, pick one. The Phoenix Lights is something else. You have a 22-mile across craft. Everybody says it's not from this earth. Well, that's a little arrogant, because if you know what the military has, it could have been, for all we know, a gigantic dirigible of some kind. They're using gigantic zeppelins now in sort of diamond shapes to now transport troops and things from one place to another. It's also that, again, the key to this whole thing is that once you understand what gravity is, that's the next step in human evolution. The next step in human evolution, take all the other science and throw it out the window. When you know what gravity, not what it does, the Newtonian theory of gravity, or even the Einsteinian theory of gravity, that gravity does certain things at speed, or you drop something and it falls. It's not what gravity does, but what gravity is. Once you understand what gravity is, and you can create gravity like a wave, exactly like we can create microwaves or gamma rays or any other type of wave, then that's pretty much it. By the understanding of gravity, you suddenly then break the bounds of Earth. You break the bounds of time and space as we know it, because now you can create gravity exactly like you could create you know, microwaves to heat your food, as an example. And apparently at somewhere like Area 51, they had broken that. It was a rather exotic technology that was powered supposedly by this element that did not come from this planet, element 115, but supposedly powered these ships. And I mean, I saw them work. Whether or not it was, you know, aliens or human beings inside them, I don't know. But I mean, I saw them, I got them on film, disappearing and reappearing and doing 90-degree turns. And, you know, I had one almost hit my car and land like a top and glow with a kind of a brilliant aura around the outside of it. And, you know, me and my pal got our faces burned chasing after this thing. So, but once again, who knows? It's not like they get out and say, hey, how you doing? And, you know, that's the one other thing, too, that I noticed that in any of the ufology, you will notice that the majority of these UFO investigators are more than willing to talk to somebody when they see a UFO. And somebody can say, well, it was this big and it was that bright and it did this color and it did these things and it bounced up and down and ooh, it was weird. The minute that UFO lands and people get out and start talking to humans and giving them any kind of message, then that's when all the UFO debunkers, you know, they get out the hammers and the nails and start screaming to Pontius Pilate that somebody needs to be crucified. Whenever you see extraterrestrial contactees like Billy Meyer or Adrienne or Fred Bell or Alice Haggerty or some of the, you know, some of the people that I've become friends with, the minute the UFOs actually have something to say, you know, that's when ufology seems to really shut down. And the really amazing thing was that if Peter Jennings did a follow-up to his Seeing is Believing and actually interviewed people that had actually, and we're not just talking about getting strapped to tables and, you know, getting anally probed and having things jammed in their eye or, you know, up their butts or, you know, whatever else. We're talking about actual conversation like you and I are having, where in so many cases, they've actually warned us, they've warned us about ecological disaster, they've warned us about geological disaster, they've warned us about disease, about plague, about things about the future. And in some cases, they've given us science, they've given us technology. They've been in contact with scientists around the world. And who knows, for all we know, the Roswell saucer fell out of the sky and gave us lasers and night vision and transistors and computers, and, you know, most of the modern world we have today represented this quantum leap from literally a deus ex machina that, you know, that drops from the sky, that puts us where we're at today. So as far as the definitive proof, again, if seeing is believing and if videotape is the next best thing, that's the real revolution. The real revolution is that 30 years ago, you had to rely on your Uncle Bob at a picnic, you know, who may be drunk on something, you know, watching a UFO fly around. The 90s and the advent of the 90s in like 1991 or so was when you could have dozens of people in Mexico filming UFOs from, you know, dozens of different angles, that when you can have dozens of people in Phoenix filming UFOs from dozens of different angles, you know something's there, and you have a piece of physical evidence that can be analyzed in a computer as far as height, width, breadth, where it is, do parallax photography to figure out, you know, what's going on. And but once again, the people that actually seem to have contact, that are trying to give us some kind of information, trying to give us some kind of warning, either about the future or the future of mankind, or give us some type of spiritual teaching, are tarred and feathered, and usually run out of town on a rail. And that's the really sad part, because they're looked at as the crazy ones, whereas in the past they were the prophets of the Old Testament. They were the, you know, Isaiahs and the Ezekiels and the Daniels and Elijahs and Elishas. And I don't think a single thing has changed in 5,000 years. I think that people are still having prophetic contact with these beings, that they're interacting with us on a daily basis, and some are positive and some are negative. Not like they pick up the phone and say, hey, this is what's going on. And even when you talk to guys that claim they know, you always have to take it with a grain of salt and a great deal of suspicion, and kind of put your tongue in your cheek and give it a wink a bit. One of the grandfathers of the entire UFO movement, I think one of the pioneers of it really, was George Adamski. And when George Adamski wrote his books in the early 1950s, Flying Saucers Are Real and Inside the Spaceships, Adamski had a series of experiences, and I got to interview people that knew Adamski personally, people that took some of Adamski's photos, someone that took some of his film. We interviewed Madeline Rutherford in Silver Springs, Maryland, who was standing right next to Adamski when the famous footage of the UFO that was like right in her yard, and told us the whole experience about these two gentlemen in trench coats and hats that she said one was from Venus and one was from Mars, and she offered them milk and cookies, and they said, are you ready? And he said yes, and they went out in the yard and they went down to a car, and they got on a microphone in the car, and a football-shaped sized object came in and began to scan the whole area. And the scout ship came down, and Madeline was there. She had her leg was in a hip cast at that time, and she said she was shaking so violently that Adamski finally took the camera and actually shot the film on his own. But Adamski had some amazing experiences. Every single one of these experiences was, in fact, verified by our own Gemini, Mercury, and Apollo astronauts. Adamski said, for example, just a couple of interesting things. And once again, remember, this is 1951, between 51 and 53. Adamski talked about that when you left orbit around Earth, that there were these weird fireflies that coruscated around the outside of the ship that he could see through the window, that he thought might be alive. This weird kind of sparkling light effect. And this was one of the things that was described by John Glenn in his first orbits around the moon. These bizarre little bugs that he said that looked like lightning bugs, you know, all around the outside of the ship. Adamski described accurately the backside of the moon, for example, which had not been seen to that time. Described the Tsaroslavsky crater on the back of the moon. Described a huge hexagonal dent in the backside of the moon. Described a lake on the backside of the moon, which was all photographed by the Russians. Talked about, you know, went on from there, and of course this is where his information differs from what we're being told, mind you, but went on from there to say that the moon, especially on the backside and in certain areas, had atmosphere, that you could actually, with about 24 hours of decompression, get out and walk around on the lunar surface. In fact, there are so many people who are claiming that, with books like Dark Moon and all these, you know, claiming that the whole moon landing was a big hoax. I mean, I know the guys that went there. I know that it wasn't a hoax. However, I also think that NASA was not being straight up about the actual nature of the moon, about its gravity, about its makeup, about its surface, in fact, about its atmosphere. There were so many anomalies that were sent back by Apollo, including UFOs and all kinds of freaky things flying around, that I don't think it could have been a hoax. Had it been a hoax that they tricked up in a studio somewhere, then you wouldn't have had these anomalies. It would have been a completely controlled experience. Adamski went on to talk about giving the proper number of the moons around Jupiter. He talked about how there was an actual planet at the core of the gases of Jupiter. He talked about visiting Venus. And to this day, I don't think anybody's actually given us the straight scoop on Venus. He talked about Mars. Every Martian photo that's taken is actually filtered through a lab in San Diego before any of those photos actually hit JPL up in Pasadena. The famous Mars photos you see today, where the planet's all red, have been run through a savage red filter in order to cover up the fact that there are massive green belts and clouds and, you know, water all over the planet. So I don't know if this information is being kept away from the public to make them think that this is it, and that Earth is just, we're stranded here, and that there's no point in going out into space, and there's no point in expanding, and, you know, you're done, and this is your world, and this is your finite universe, or the elites are simply covering all this up in order to possibly keep it for themselves. When you talk about the elite, or, well, I mean, to put it in more perspective, I mean, to actually use what they call themselves. And you know, and I went to school with a bunch of these kids. When you go to USC, it's it was a pretty bougie school. And when you go to school with, like, you know, Rothschilds and whatever else, you learn a few things. The core inner group, which is probably so secret you don't hear the word much, but they call themselves the Incunabula. And the Incunabula means, it's a Latin term which means nest of serpents, or clutch of serpents' eggs. And they seem to be in the inner core of a board of about 15 people or so that are kind of the CEOs and executive board of the planet Earth, if you will. And from there, the Incunabula has everything from the Advanced Contact Intelligence Organization to, which then trickles down towards NASA. The outer core is the Council on Foreign Relations, which recruits between 2,500 and about 3,500 members or so. The inner core becomes the Trilateral Commission, you know, going up and up and up. As far as depopulation goes, you know, once again, I don't know. All we can do is theorize. It's not like they call me on the phone. There seem to be two schools of thought on this. The one school of thought is that no, they don't want depopulation because, you know, who would be their slaves? Who would serve them, if you will? And the other school of thought on this is that during the Industrial Revolution, we needed people, and we needed people primarily to work the machines. We needed people to work in the factories. Now we've gone beyond people, and now we have machines that build machines that build machines. And because that is in fact the case, we now have a surplus population where they become what Hitler called the useless eaters. And they're people that are just taking up space and taking up natural resources and basically just messing up the world. And that now that these elite have these machines that build the machines, that it's time for them to depopulate the world, and for them to do this using a series of plagues and global wars. And atomic conflicts are not do not seem to be something that that they're interested in using. They're interested in using the threat of atomic conflict in order to milk the populace. The other thing about atomic conflict is that there does seem to be a universal consensus amongst UFO contactees that if we were to engage in nuclear war, that a nuclear war, especially using hydrogen and or cobalt bombs, would bleed over into other dimensions and actually not only affect this world, but apparently Earth's in an infinite number of parallel universes. And when many of these mass UFO contacts began after 1945, it was no coincidence that we started testing atomic weapons. Once again, the atomic weapons have the ability to not only destroy the Earth, but also rip the fabric of time and space as we know it. And almost universally amongst UFO contactees that I've interviewed, they said that the only time that these extraterrestrials would step in would be if mankind was at the verge of using these weapons, and that they would step in and actually stop it, not really for our own good, but for the sake of the rest of the solar system and apparently the rest of the universe. As far as the elites go, what their plan is, I don't know. If you read the Council on Foreign Relations quarterly reports like I do, if you've ever read Carol Quigley, if you've ever read any of these guys who teach at Harvard, my best, and I'll just give my best guess how these guys think. My best guess is that they have a much better idea through their scientists and their scientific and computer models what the Earth is going through, and that Earth is going to go through a very rapid global greenhouse. In other words, get very, very warm very, very quickly, and then get very cold very quickly. That basically we're looking at the not the beginning of another hot age, if you will, but another ice age. And that when the planet gets very hot, it then begins to cool itself with all kinds of volcanoes. For example, today, I don't know if you know this while you guys have been sitting here, but about 4 hours ago, Mount St. Helens erupted with plumes about 3,000 feet in the air. There were 700 earthquakes earlier today underneath Puget Sound, which means that Seattle's getting ready to go. This is a fulfillment of many of my predictions, where I've been saying that watch for activity at Mount Rainier approximately May of 2005, May through September, and all that's beginning to activate now, beginning my whole tribulation scenario of 2005 to approximately 2007. But they know that when the Earth gets hot, you have these volcanoes. The volcanoes dump silicates into the atmosphere. The silicates then cool the planet when the sunlight actually bounces off the atmosphere, and then it leads to another ice age. If that's in fact the case, what these elites think is that the best slaves are a combination of Asiatics and Caucasians, and they want to actually mix Caucasians with Asians because they feel that the Caucasians are stronger and have a work ethic, if you will, and that the Asians have more of a hive mind, that they think more as a team to combine these two together, but then move that population down towards the equators, where obviously the world is going to be much warmer. Of course, the problem is you have people who live at the equators, like in Africa, and so the best way, if you're going to populate something as rich in minerals as Africa, is to wipe out the population by disguising things like the AIDS virus as polio vaccines. And so with some 200 million dead in Africa over the last 15 or 20 years from AIDS, with massive civil wars raging across the continents where they're all killing each other anyway, with more of these diseases in South America at the same time, their ultimate goal is to take their, quote, slave or working populations and start moving them down towards the equators. In the meantime, you have massive underground cave systems, gigantic governmental structures that have been built for the last 60 years underground. You have to remember that they've had half the federal budget to go towards defense in the supposed Cold War to build gigantic underground facilities. The entire state of Nevada is nothing but one huge running underground facility that connects Area 51 with the Dulce Mesa, with NORAD, with Strategic Air Command with an entire baffle of cave systems and structures that run from Carlsbad Caverns in Arizona all the way up through Arizona. These same cave systems were mostly built as part of. There's actually a series of underground tunnels that have very high speed electric trains that run from place to place. Supposedly, you can get from the Dulce Mesa to Washington D.C. in under about an hour and a half on one of these trains. They're like porcelain-covered trains. Again, this was all part of Eisenhower's Audubon project. That while they were building roads on the surface, they were building roads underground at the same time. Most of the massive underground building that's been taking place, just what I discovered, a friend of mine owns one of the largest mines in North America in Kellogg, Idaho, and I talked to people that make these giant drill bits, these huge wheels that are like 100 feet across. And the guy says, we're working 24/7 and we're shipping all these things down to Australia because they're building a gigantic underground facility in Alice Springs, which is in the center part of Australia, which many believe has been the most geologically stable over the course of millions of years. And Alice Springs is called the Australian Area 51. And who knows? Do these power elites simply plan on destroying the world and wiping out most of the world's population while they sit safely in their underground bunkers? Can they use the technology at Area 51 to get to bases on the moon or possibly bases on Mars, that have been there for many, many years? Certainly they seem to have some sort of economic agenda that seems to be designed to turn the entire planet into a Orwellian 1984 style nightmare, sort of Eurasia, East Asia, and Oceania, where you have three warring countries and three major currencies with the euro and the Federal Reserve note and the yuan, and they are months away from collapsing U.S. currency, collapsing the U.S. stock market, doing a number of nefarious things to actually break the United States of America for introduction into this one world superstate. I would not think that they would put quite so much time into the economics and the politics and the industry and all the plotting and planning that they've done, to simply come up with some kind of doomsday device to simply wipe out the earth as we know it. There seems to have been an infinite amount of patience and planning on the part of the Incunabula, this ruling elite, if you will, into controlling the populations of the earth. That, once again, you have these two warring factions. One group that says, well, they're just going to wipe everything out. Well, if they wanted to do that, they could probably just flip the planet over tomorrow if they wanted. And another group that says, well, total totalitarian controls and chips in everybody's heads and this fascist Orwellian nightmare. Well, you got to have slaves to have an Orwellian nightmare. On the one hand, the elite's got to have somebody to boss around. And on the other hand, if they just want to wipe everybody out, well, who's going to mow the lawn and do the laundry? Well, the only reason that I really started doing the prophetic work is because when I'd done my spiritual training in India, and I lived with the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala for about 3 months or so, or at least at his at the compound there at Dharamsala, and then for about 8 months or so in Nepal at a place called Tengbache. It was a black hat monastery right across the Tibetan border in Nepal. And I came home and I had the ability to be able to predict these things and very, very clearly visualize certain events. I didn't know what to do with it. The first major event that I remember predicting Gus Grissom's death when I was a little kid. And I remember having these psychic visions when I was younger, and of course we came from a very good Catholic family, and later became like biblical fundamentalists, and that was just not the kind of thing that you did. My grandmother was Irish, and she knew that I had the sight, as she used to call it, and I could, quote, see around a few corners, as she used to say, and kind of protected me from my parents. And so I was remarkable in that aspect, but it was also something that I developed over a long period of time through study and through Western techniques like remote viewing, and through Eastern techniques like the Karma Kegyu black hat practices. And the first big thing I remember predicting here was the San Francisco earthquake in 1989. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to tell. I took friends of mine from Northern California. I knew the quake was coming. I said it was going to be between October 15th and October 30th of '89. There was going to be a big quake that was going to majorly impact San Francisco. We took a group of about 20 people or so up to Mount Shasta to do some prayers and see if we could actually deflect the energy of the quake. And just a complete disaster. Everybody got in fights, and everybody wanted to go every different way, and nobody wanted to listen. And I think we managed to successfully drag about 4 people up the hill to do some kind of meditations, because Mount Shasta is a vortex where you could control most of the energies of Northern California. And at that time, I saw the vortex of Mount Shasta as just being horrifically dark. I saw what used to be an angelic refuge filled with hobos, if you will. Made me sick, made me just deathly ill for weeks afterwards after we did it. This was October 1st of 1989 when we took this group of people up there. And of course the quake hit on the 17th. And I was hiding up in Lake Tahoe at my folks' house up there when the quake actually hit during the World Series. And the only thing I was told in my meditations by my masters was that we'd at least managed to drive the quake south of San Francisco into Hollister instead of, dead center of San Francisco. And that was, we could be happy with that, I guess. Since then, the reason I took up the prophetic work is because I saw so many people, I felt, creating fear and creating, at the time in the early 1990s, you had people that were saying that, well, California's going to fall into the ocean any day, and Elizabeth Clare Prophet had moved out in the 1980s claiming that, Malibu was going to be destroyed, and Shirley MacLaine left, and, you had so many people that misinterpreting Nostradamus, and I was the only one that was saying, everything's going to be fine, it's going to be okay, that these are all natural rumblings of the earth. My prediction about the Northridge earthquake, which was made 8 months in advance, I started printing a newsletter because I needed to get down my predictions in print. And at that time, I was a guest on the Art Bell show. And initially, I was talking about Area 51, and Art let me talk about, because I was an intuitive that was investigating UFOs, not some, UFO guy that became like some, spiritual guru. I had always been somebody on a spiritual path that was simply drawn towards the UFO phenomenon because I'd witnessed it myself, and, I didn't have an abduction. I'm not a contactee or an abductee or any kind of E. I just, had some cool things happen to me that I became really interested in and started becoming interested in the government cover-up of UFOs in general, and, how they had these craft at this, at this base. So in the course of that, I've been doing this work now for 14 years. I started in March of 93, 2003. Yeah, 10, 4, 5, so 12 years or so when I've been doing this work. And with that, I've been the #1 guest on probably the #1 late night radio show in the world, which was Coast to Coast with Art Bell and later with George Norrie, and hosting my own radio show. I can't even go into this, just the massive litany of predictions that I've gotten correct. It's one of the things that has contributed to my, I guess, fame, or if you want to call it that, success on programs like this, is that, I'm not a complete jackass. I don't get up there and, I'm invited back to these programs because what I say happens. And when I have a vision and when I make a prediction, I not only have the vision and the prediction, but I try to back it up, and I try to do as much research saying, okay, which way is this going to come, and how is this going to, how is this going to scope in a certain way. And actually, I've probably gotten the most fame for my financial predictions, because knowing how cycles work and knowing how the Bible works and knowing how things run in systems of 7 and along the Hebrew calendar, I've managed to successfully predict the stock market dead on over the past 10 years or so, more successfully than anybody, I think, ever. And as far as my predictions go, gosh, from the Northridge quake to the Landers quake to the San Francisco quake to to every election, I've been dead on. From the election of in 1990, I predicted that Bush would lose to a Democratic dark horse, to the prediction of Clinton, to the re-entrance of Ross Perot in the presidential race, to Clinton's re-election, to in 97 saying Bush was going to be president. It just goes on and on and on and on. We don't have enough time here for me to go over, the last 10 years, what I've been right about. 2005 was has always been the linchpin, and I've always said, since I started doing this, I knew this since I was a boy, and my family visited Egypt, and I went to school there, and I had some experiences in the Great Pyramid when I was like 16 years old. That 2005 was going to be the beginning, and that by the fall of 2005, that we would have 1 year of warning from September of 2005, let's call it October 1st of 2005, to approximately October of 2004, I'm sorry, to approximately October 1st of 2005. And I've said that over and over and over again, and I think we're there. I mean, within a couple of months of that prediction, we've had the 7th worst natural disaster in global history, with the Sumatran tsunami with close to 200,000 dead and more dead from disease. As of today, as of us taping this, which is the 7th of March of 2005, earlier this morning you had hundreds of earthquakes in Puget Sound underneath Seattle, and you had a major eruption of Mount St. Helens, 3,000 feet in the air. The plumes are going. I've been saying that Mount Rainier was going to start to activate with a possible eruption between May and September of this year, that you would see the beginning of that activation this year. And of course, Mount St. Helens became active within that period of time. Last year, I became probably the most famous because, you know, back in February of 2004, I predicted that John Kerry was going to be the presidential candidate, that not only would Bush win, but that he would win by a landslide, he would win by a mandate. When everybody believed that Kerry was going to be, you know, the Zogby polls, and every psychic and every astrologer and, you know, every New Age purple moo-moo wearing woo-woo out there was saying, oh, it's going to be John Kerry and it's going to be wonderful. And I said, that ain't the way it's going to be. It's going to be Bush. Sorry, you know, he's the man that's going to bring all this about. And you know, it's hard because you stand up and you take so much grief from so many people. The laugh factor of people beating you down, and then when you're right, what do? You know, you go, well, I guess I was right, and people go, you know, yeah, what does he know? You know, who's he when he's at home? But we're looking at a 7-year tribulation period here from 2005 to 2012, leading up to the end of the Mayan calendar. And anybody that studies prophecy, anybody that understands the Mayans and the Great Pyramid of Chichen Itza and the Great Pyramid of Giza and the prophecies of Nostradamus and the prophecies of the Bible or whatever else knows that this is it. That these are 7 years that will change the face of the world as we know it, that will change us spiritually, it will change the planet geologically, that will change everything politically, that will change everything economically. We're looking at a huge flux in the stock market coming up in May. We're looking at one last big run of the market before a humongous financial collapse in the United States. We're looking at a 2-tiered money system and money structure with a foreign and domestic currency with a lot of hyperinflation in the U.S. to pay, you know, the bills for all these massive wars. We're looking at the collapse of America as an empire, and every empire thinks it's different, and every empire winds up exactly the same, and that's exactly what America's doing. We're grabbing everything we can get our hands on before, you know, trying to gobble up as much gold and treasure as we can to feed the interest monster, you know, before the banks take over everything. Yeah, collapse of the real estate markets, collapse of the housing markets, collapse of the financial markets. Everything that I've ever run, as far as patterns, as far as waves, as far as social structures, they all just hit a wall in 2005. It ends. We have a whole economic cycle that goes from October of 1987, which was the last big stock market crash, all the way up through 2005. But everything, as I know it, hits a wall in late 2005, early spring of 2006. And whether or not that's triggered by nobody wanting to deal in the U.S. dollar, just like Korea did about 2 weeks ago. They don't want to buy our T-bills anymore. They don't want to deal in dollars because the dollar's getting killed against the euro because the euro's backed by gold and the Federal Reserve note's backed by nothing. Our money is backed by the faith, energy, and spirit of the people of the United States. That's it. It means that just the fact that you and I get up in the morning is what the economy is based on. The foundation for all of the rest of these biblical prophecies to occur, including the rise of an Iranian antichrist and a conglomeration of 7 Arab nation states along with 3 Asian states. I've been saying from the beginning that this entire war in the Middle East, the Red Chinese are behind, and they are. They've been funding it, they've been financing it, they've been giving weapons to it, so it will not be surprising when Islam actually aligns with China and these 3 Asian kings. That the big earthquake in Los Angeles, something happens that, you know, we'll see if New York gets the Olympics or not. My prediction had been that New York would get the Olympics. Something dastardly would happen, something terrible would happen to New York City, and that at the very last minute they're going to talk about moving the Olympics to Los Angeles. And before they could actually do that, every time I've viewed Los Angeles, the big quake in Los Angeles, if this is going on tape now, I always see just to the west of the main city of LA, and I keep thinking it's for the Olympics, but they build this huge tower like the Space Needle. It actually has an angel on top of the tower that has a glowing sword on top of the tower, very much like the symbol for Columbia Pictures, where instead of the torch, she's holding a glowing sword. It's a huge structure, though, and I always see something added to the skyline every time I view the quake and this wave coming into Los Angeles. So LA will become known as the Olympic City again, and everybody just kind of tricks everything up because something happens to New York. The greatest thing I'm worried about has to do with the breaking of the New Madrid Fault sometime in 2011 and 2012. You know, this is kind of the timeline for all these natural catastrophes. I've always seen a massive wave taking out big chunks of the East Coast. The possible eruption of a volcano on the island of Las Palmas, which is in the Canary Islands, which if that volcano goes, that's the sword of Damocles that's hanging over the head of the entire East Coast. If Las Palmas goes in the Canary Islands and that whole island splits off and dives into the sea, we're talking about 60-foot tidal waves that would just wash across Cuba, Jamaica, Florida. I've always seen water problems with New York. I don't see New York destroyed. I see it surviving a near miss of some kind of atomic attack by a boat, I think. Something actually comes into the harbor and they explode this thing outside in the water. And then this big wave that comes and starts taking out big chunks of the coast. So outside of that, I keep having dreams about the Pope and the Pope dying on the 13th of May, which is significant because that's a significant date for the appearance of the Virgin Mary. I noticed that when Sister Lucia, who was the last of the children of Fatima, died, who the Pope had constantly said was his rock and the beacon of his faith, when she died a few days later, the Pope checked himself into the hospital. And therefore I don't see the Pope living up the year, but once again I keep seeing the date May 13th. That will pave the way for 2 more popes. The Pope of the Glorious Olive Branch, as he'll be called, who rule for quite a few years and bring peace to a number of different regions. And then the very last of the popes, the last shall be first, Peter of Rome, Petros Romanus. Just as Peter was the first pope, he'll also be the last pope. He'll also be known as the Black Pope, not because he's physically black, but because the Benedictines and the Jesuits actually wear black cassocks with red piping, whereas the Pope wears white as part of his order. The Benedictines wear black, and so he'll be known as the Black Pope and be the last pope of the Catholic Church before much of Rome is destroyed and much of the Catholic Church is completely destroyed. And that's just phase one leading up to 2012. And I think with the collapse of all of these monetary and economic and social and support structures, that people are going to start banding together and actually begin a new civilization that's based on things of the spirit, not things of the material. And it is the quantum leap in consciousness and the ascension frequency that brings people to this very, very high level of love and sharing and much more of a tribal society that brings everybody together by 2012. But in the same breath, it will be this tribal society, this gathering of Jedi Knights, if you will, that will be the activation of the 144,000 that's spoken of in the book of Revelation, and the multitudes upon multitudes dressed in white who follow these empowered prophets and saints that are the ones who fight the last great war against the dragon of the kings of the East, the armies of the 200 million that comes down somewhere around the year 2018 or so, between 2018 and about 2020. Going further than that, I see a very, very large meteor hitting the planet sometime in 2027 or 2028, knocks the planet slightly off kilter for about 7 years or so. 2034 brings extraterrestrial intervention for the first time, something called the Day of Appearance, where every craft in this whole sector of space appears for 1 day. They move the planet into its proper orbit, fix the rotation, clean up the atmosphere, and that's it. They just disappear. They don't help us. They just put the planet back to where it's supposed to be. And that this is the precursor for the birth of the next Messiah, who's a woman, by the way, who calls herself the Emanuela, and by the time she's 4 or 5 years old, She discovers the Ark of the Covenant, the Staff of Ra, the Caduceus, a massive amount of ancient Atlantean technology that transmutes and transforms matter, almost like a teleporter, if you will. She's 5 or 6 years old by the time everybody on the planet recognizes her as the physical incarnation of some amazing angelic force. And she becomes the leader of a loosely confederated, I wouldn't say world government, but world confederacy, if you will, that then brings peace and prosperity to the world. By 2050, the entire planet is completely rebuilt. By 2060, 2075, there's travel to other planets, there's people on the moon, there's people on Mars. It begins a golden age of human expansion and development. So it's not that far away when you're thinking, for example, we're going through a 40-year Exodus period that began in 1999 and ends in approximately 2039 with the coming of the Messiah. That has been prophesied by the Great Pyramid of Giza, by the Great Pyramid of Chichen Itza, by the Mayan calendar, by the ancient prophets. And I think she takes everybody by surprise. Everybody's certainly expecting, Jesus to come down on a beam of light instead of, which the Christ force does come on a beam of light, with the saucers and the whirlwinds at her heels, if you will. But there's a body of evidence in the Old Testament that shows that this next Messiah will be the twin flame of Christ, so to speak, and it'll be a woman very much with the motherly, nurturing nature that will help to rebuild the world as we know it.